If there's one thing I really appreciate about League is that for all the anguish it puts us through with its questionable balance decisions, they do a lot of things correctly, one of which is how despite having now over 160 playable champions, the game does an excellent job at making every single one of them as close to viable as humanly possible. That is to say, every member of the cast is to some degree worthwhile to play while having their own merits that contribute towards the central win condition, something a lot less common in other games with an extensive roster. The fact that League manages to make all of its champions usable enough to be worth investing time into is something Riot should be very proud of, even if they still have a lot of work to do. However, there exists one champion who, ever since debuting in 2016, has never once had a moment of influence throughout the meta. Interestingly, those who were brazen enough to try him out achieved reasonable success, both in solo queue and pro play. But no matter how strong he was, hardly anyone could find it within themselves to play him, making him quite possibly the least played champion in the history of League. Aurelion Sol has been touted as one of the most visually and experientially appealing champions to ever exist, and for roughly half a decade, players held out hope that the champion design team would one day figure out how to make him feel as good as he looks. 7 long years have passed and our prayers were answered, but was it in the way we expected? Only one way to find out. Today, it's with great excitement and apprehension that I present to you Aurelion Sol's Rework, Retrospective. By the way, if you're interested in putting some skin in the game as you try out the new Sol, then feel free to enter a tournament through Repeat.gg, which is sponsoring my channel once again. Repeat.gg is a tournament platform that runs different events ranging from how good you are at carrying games to your performance overall in solo queue. You can join as many tournaments as you want and earn prizes including points and real cash paid out to the top 30 to 40% of users in each tourney. Examples of items you can buy with points are gift cards like Amazon, Fortnite V-Bucks, Riot points, what have you, and there's no need to download anything. Just connect your account to Repeat and it will track your stats automatically. They give out over $60,000 in cash every month, so if you like to buy skins and stuff but don't feel like spending money, this is one way to do it. And they have tournaments for other games like Dota, Warzone, PUBG, and Fortnite if you're into them as well. It's a really cool platform that lets you earn some extra stuff just by doing what you've already been doing, so head on over to their website using my link on screen or in the description below. I appreciate Repeat for sponsoring me again, but without further ado, let's get back to the video. Even amidst all the unique and quirky champions of the modern age, Sol stood out in many ways. Not only was he the most savage motherfucker in existence, and that's not an exaggeration by the way, you should see how he talks to other champions, man's got no chill.
There is a saying on this planet, dumb as a rock. It's not a compliment.
But he also had a very unique playstyle that you don't see from anyone else. In other words, if you wanted to play Aurelion Sol, you had to forget everything you knew about the game and relearn it through him. You also couldn't transfer anything you learned while playing him into another champion. Anything and everything you wanted to do remained mutually exclusive from everyone else. Initially, the trade-off was worth it. Early performances from him were beyond stellar, as he effortlessly maintained a win rate around 55 to 60% for the first 2 years, which would be unacceptably high for anyone else to have. A good explanation of why his win rate was so high could have been that no one knew how to play against him since he was so uncommon. But even then, there was a lot of potential with this champion, potential that was kept gated by how uncomfortable he was to play. Unlike other unpopular champions who were hindered by being either extremely weak or extremely degenerate, Sol was quite good from a pragmatic standpoint. He had incredible zone control through his area coverage and persistent damage output, which he could exert by pushing waves quickly and then roaming elsewhere. Having that kind of pressure as a mid laner is a major source of appeal. In his case though, the very defining aspect of his gameplay that made him so powerful was also the reason he was so unpleasant to control. Center of the Universe caused 3 stars to orbit around his position, damaging all enemies he came in contact with. This was his primary mechanism for DPS, making him one of the few champions in the game whose source of damage was provided by an external force, similarly to Azir and Orianna. Due to their fixed range of orbit, Sol's playstyle involved a great deal of spacing and neutral, making sure any nearby threats were at 325 or 650 units away, as that would be the only area where he could exert any good measure of damage. The stars followed a set path and speed, so the onus fell on the player to adjust their position to increase their output. The only way they could remotely adjust his passive was through Celestial Expansion, where for 3 seconds he would expand his stars to the outer limit, greatly increasing their damage output, rotation speed, and range before retracting to their original circumference. In essence, Sol had 2 ranges, his base of 325 and a max of 650. The other 2 damaging abilities provided some assistance in ensuring more hits from his passive. Star Surge projected an expanding star that dealt magic damage and stunned all enemies hit based on how far it traveled. Theoretically, the effect radius of Sol's Q was infinite, and there have been instances where it was so big it covered an entire lane, with up to a 3-second stun to all enemies hit. Obviously, the point of this was to keep enemies stuck in place so you can line up your stars for easy boops, and was primarily used as a kiting or pursuit tool. Sol could use his Q while running away to detonate it quickly and get a few hits in, or he could use his Q to chase down fleeing opponents thanks to the increased movement speed and growing range of the star the farther he travels. Voice of Light, on the other hand, was more of an immediate self-peel tool. Due to his passive having a minimum target range of 625, Sol needed some way to force anyone within that radius to get out so he could actually deal damage, and so whenever his ultimate struck an opponent within his outer limit, they would get knocked towards it, allowing him to once again throw a bunch of easy stars at them. All things considered, Sol's game plan was perfectly fine. He had everything a battle mage needed: area coverage, persistent damage, and situational defensive and offensive utility. Individually, it may not seem like his stars do a whole lot, but that was sort of what made him so dangerous. The inconspicuous and seemingly innocuous nature of his passive would make him appear as a non-threat until you were thrown in a full-blown teamfight where suddenly the enemy team would notice their health is getting melted out of nowhere. Aurelion Sol's damage output could easily reach astronomical levels if played correctly. That's what made him so terrifying in the first place and why his win rate was so high for the first few years of his career. Those who knew how to weaponize him would completely dominate games, using his global tempo and passive damage to gain priority and control of the map that few, if any other mid laners could match. The carry potential was and is there, yet even during his prime, hardly anyone was interested in trying him out. Not because he wasn't strong or satisfying to play, it was because, as I mentioned earlier, Sol required you to play the game in a way no other champion did. There is no one else in the game with a melee dead zone. No one. Barring Voice of Light, if an enemy champion made it past the asteroid belt, so to speak, Sol had no way of dealing damage other than running away and tossing Star Surge as you got out. This made him a very easy target for assassins and divers, the two most popular classes in the game. Any rushdown champion could break past his rather fragile defenses and shred him to pieces without him being able to do anything. For 5 years and change, League was in the midst of a burst damage and mobility-centric meta. Champions are getting faster, both in how fast they moved around and how fast they dealt damage. Aurelion Sol's entire identity was the antithesis of that, someone who prefers to play slow and keep everyone at arm's length. Champions like Diana, Camille, Irelia, Hecarim, Echo, Yona, Zed, Talon pervert the opposite, blitzing you down with equal parts force and speed. In essence, the overall experience of the game, not just the meta, was shifting against what Sol excelled at. Everyone is more or less aware of what he's capable of, yet at the same time we also understand how vulnerable he is against the dominant champions. Even for those who prefer to have a line of scrimmage between them and their opponent like backline mages and marksmen, they could still exert their pressure whether up close or from afar. The range advantage was just to avoid the possibility of dying. Aurelion Sol's range wasn't an advantage, it was a requirement, as not only would his life be in danger if his opponent was right in his face, but he would also lose the ability to damage that champion since you couldn't retract the stars any closer than 325 units. Overall, to many, Aurelion Sol was the epitome of a deal breaker. He's everything you want in a mage: damage, tempo, area coverage, control, and a very fun playstyle. But he chews with his mouth open. Players simply could not get used to how helpless he felt when gap closed on, especially when that problem was exacerbated with all the new high mobility champions. It was bad enough that every new champion excelled at getting right in his face and invalidating his passive damage, but then they released items like Protobelt, Prowess Claw, and Stridebreaker at least before the dash was taken out. So now everyone had gap closers. It became clear that it didn't matter how strong Sol was, as long as he had that melee dead zone, no one wanted to play him. As much as it defined who he was as a champion, center of the universe was holding him back. Maybe in another game where things were more methodical or slow-tempoed, Sol would find success, but not in League, not how it is now. Some may say the change to his W, where he could no longer toggle it on and off, was the one that really killed him, but I disagree. Even if they were to bring back his W toggle, he would still feel awful to play against all the hyper-burst, hyper-mobility champions dominating the game right now. I'm almost certain of it, seeing as the champion redesign team did away with this passive entirely. That's right, Aurelion Sol no longer has orbiting stars. But then, what's his new source of damage? Well, it's what any dragon's damage would be: fire. Even though he looks the same, new Sol plays vastly different from the old one, so we'll have to go through things one at a time. His new passive is Cosmic Creator. Anytime he deals damage, he accumulates Stardust at varying rates depending on who it is, affecting the rest of his abilities. It's basically Veigar's passive combined with Thresh. He has a unique scaling mechanic that grows stronger by attacking things, mostly champions. Not as unique as Center of the Universe, but let's see what his other abilities are. Breath of Light is his new Q and new source of DPS. For just over 3 seconds, he breathes fire in a straight line that stops on the first enemy hit, dealing magic damage repeatedly to them and enemies nearby. If he damages the same enemy for at least 1 second, they take an extra burst of magic damage and he gains 1 Stardust if it's a champion. Breath of Light behaves functionally similar to Vel'Koz's Lifeform Disintegration Ray, in tandem with Organic Deconstruction, where the laser beam applies constant damage and the burst damage resembles a true damage burst from Vel'Koz's passive. Sol can even rotate the Q while standing still, just like Vel'Koz. Another thing to make note of is that at rank 5, he can channel Breath of Light for as long as he can pay the mana cost, so this ability basically becomes a toggle at rank 5. As sad as I am to see the orbiting stars go away, I understand why they had to. Breath of Light is a more practical and accessible form of damage, and while it forces him to remain in place to use it, it at least gives him a means of applying pressure regardless of how close his opponent is. Then again, this could come as a bit of a culture shock for previous Asol mains. His whole gameplay before was to constantly be on the move, never stay still, and always run around trying to position his stars correctly. Meanwhile, Breath of Light, disregarding its interaction with his new W, roots him in place while using it. This could be jarring for anyone with experience playing the old version. Speaking of his W, it's Astral Flight, the spiritual successor of Comet of Legend. Astral Flight lets him fly in a target direction, during which he can use Breath of Light to deal increased damage. This mechanic was put in place to maintain that feel of casting Star Surge amidst Comet of Legend, but it now means Asol can perform drive-bys, as he can do stuff like fly over Dragon or Baron Pit and use Q while flying to deal damage. Stardust interacts with Astral Flight's range, so the more Stardust, the faster you can fly, and if he scores a takedown on an enemy champion, it refunds 90% of the ability's cooldown. Basically reset. Wouldn't be a modern League of Legends champion without some form of cooldown reset now, would it? What separates Astral Flight from Comet of Legend is that now, instead of a long distance roaming tool, it covers less ground in exchange for being usable in combat at a moment's notice. I'm not sure how I feel about this, to be honest. With Astral Flight, Asol still has a way to move around while dealing damage, but at least from a visual standpoint, it looks somewhat clunky in comparison to the fluidity of his old feel. Still far more practical though, and it still offers the same option select. Asol can use his W to chase after opponents while fire breathing on them, he can use his W to run away and still breathe fire on them, etc. The only difference is now he can actually damage them regardless of how close they are. Things really start to change with his E and ultimate. Singularity is a bit complicated, so listen up. Asol creates a black hole that pulls all enemies towards the center, as black holes tend to do. During this time, they take magic damage every second, and if anyone is caught in the center below a certain amount of health, they die instantly. Additionally, it generates Stardust when enemies get executed at the center and when champions are taking damage at all. This is cool. Way cooler than Star Surge in my opinion. The black hole gets bigger in size the more Stardust you have, so in the late game you have what is essentially a massive Rel ultimate on a basic ability. This also gives him a way to draw enemies together so he can flamethrower them, since Breath of Light has a very small radius where it can damage nearby enemies. I like this a lot. Narratively, Asol is able to bend the cosmos, and what better way to demonstrate that than by making a black hole? It's definitely a more engaging way to highlight his power than making a star that expands in size that misses most of the time anyway. Granted, he loses access to a stun on a basic ability, but the important part is that it's more impactful. Also, something I find rather curious is the execution threshold. It says any target within the center that falls below a certain amount of health goes bye-bye. That includes Baron and Dragon, so in the late game, if Asol has a bunch of Stardust, Singularity might be the single greatest objective security in the game. Baron usually has around 15,000 HP, so even a 10% threshold would make it impossible for the enemy team to steal Baron away from Asol's team, as Singularity would instantly kill Baron if it drops under 1500 HP at any point. Unless there's something I'm missing, this is a major game changer, especially in high elo and pro play. Finally, we have Falling Star, his new ultimate. Picture Soraka's Q on steroids. He literally calls down a massive meteor that impacts the target location, damaging all enemies hit, stunning them for 1.25 seconds, and granting 5 Stardust for every champion. Past level 6, once he gathers 75 Stardust, Falling Star upgrades to the Sky's Descent, throwing an even larger meteor that does more damage and knocks up all enemies hit, as well as projecting an enormous earthquake with semi-global range, damaging and slowing all enemy champions and epic monsters hit while granting vision of them. Now this is an ultimate. Voice of Light, in all honesty, was pretty lame for an ultimate. Did very little damage and even visually wasn't too crazy. This is a lot more impact, no pun intended. More importantly, it possesses greater cohesion with the rest of his kit. Singularity can draw several enemy champions to a target location where he can then aim his Falling Star to strike all of them for easy damage. Asol's pressure is a lot more flashy now, to say the least. Seeing as I'm writing all of this a few days before his expected live release, Asol's new abilities have a far greater pressure ceiling than his old ones, and they managed to pull that off while getting rid of what made him so frustrating to play. That's the whole point of a rework, to introduce a more satisfying and skill-expressive experience while removing all of or as many of the detrimental elements of a champion as possible. This reminds me a lot of Swain's rework actually. Many players were divided on his VGU because while current Swain feels a lot more impactful, it came at the cost of what made him so unique in the first place. Someone who's very neutral focused and attacks through War of Attrition instead of your typical Battle Mage ultimate and a regular damaging ability. Asol is going through the same exact thing. The very aspect that made him so iconic was also preventing him from seeing much play. So while it hurts to lose his old identity, it's a necessary sacrifice to make if it means people will actually start playing him. And besides, to me anyway, they didn't turn him into a generic battle mage. I think what they did with Singularity and Falling Star, as well as the interactions with Breath of Light and Astral Flight, are still reflective of Aesol's entire galaxy theme. If anything, I would say they're even more reflective of his narrative power than his previous iteration. So for those who think his queue is just another Rumble queue, I disagree. I think this is an overall good change for him, and I'm excited to see him in live servers. Let me know your thoughts on Aesol's new abilities in the comments down below if you do or don't like what they do with him. But that's gonna be it for today. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel, really helps me out. Also consider following me on Twitter at Vars, joining my Discord server, and feel free to watch my other rework retrospectives if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon in the next one. Take care.